Welcome to, by my calculation, the 19th annual Roger Hood lecture. The lecture was inaugurated many, many years ago to celebrate the contribution that Roger Hood, my predecessor, made to criminology both here in Oxford and in the wider world over several decades. For most of the time of its duration, Roger used to come to these events and enjoy himself thoroughly while pretending to be deeply embarrassed, which was fun for the rest of us to watch. Sadly, they now have to take place in his memory, but these events have, I think, become an important part in the Centre's kind of intellectual life and calendar, and a great way to kind of bring the academic year to a close. So, for the 19th annual lecture, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Beatrice Jauregui, currently of the University of Toronto's Centre for Criminology and Social Legal Studies. Beatrice was trained in Anthropology at Chicago, spent some time at Emmanuel College in Cambridge as a JRF before going to Toronto. She works on relationships between policing, social power, state power and the like. She's the author of Provisional Authority, a book on policing, state power and social order in India, where she conducted extensive field work. She's the editor or co-editor of a book on anthropology and counterinsurgency, and, with me and a few others, the Sage Handbook of Global Policing. She has, in the last few years, been working on this multi-site ethnography of police unions and democratic transformation and social justice, which I understand is going to make a feature. It's going to feature today. So they come to listen to you, not to me. So I'm going to sit down, and the floor is yours. Welcome to Oxford. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. It's really a privilege. So I will be talking about a program of research that I characterize broadly as the politics of collective organizing and everyday practice among police in mostly former British colonies. That said, since my current work covers regions where people speak various indigenous languages, Quebecois French, Portuguese, Spanish, and many scores of South Asian languages, the subtitle locates this knowledge in the Anglosphere, slight change from the poster, and beyond. So my lecture will draw on a combination of research that I've been doing in India for many years, with more recent studies of some political movements and self-organized policing in several indigenous communities, to consider what the decolonization of police and of policing studies might look like, and suggest some directions for future research. So we all know of the recent resurgence of long-standing decolonial and anti-racist movements that have engendered a globalized reckoning with police institutions as key figures in reproducing social orders of structural violence and legacies of colonialism. And in the face of this reckoning, which of course is as plural and local as it is global, my work asks how people who identify as police workers, and that term worker is key, as part of a combination of identities, think and act in ways that potentially decolonize the institution of which they are a part from within. And I understand that many would perhaps find a project of decolonizing police a contradiction in terms, perhaps unadvisable or even impossible. But the work that I've been doing in India and the so-called Americas suggests otherwise. So my talk today is essentially a set of notes toward a theory of decolonizing police institutions and police studies as a field of scholarly inquiry. And following a discussion of some of my methodological and theoretical groundings, I'll discuss protests, uprisings, and unionist movements among police workers in India, and a bit about Brazil, and then turn to some more recent engagements that I've had with ongoing advocacy by indigenous police in multiple regions of Turtle Island, which is a term that some indigenous communities and activists use to describe North America, but also even the world. So the analysis examines a multiplicity of cultural and class-based expressions of what community policing might mean, as well as some critical conceptions of police work as essential security labor, to elucidate the polysemy, the multiple meanings of decolonization as both process and praxis, and to consider new possibilities for being police and doing policing in settler and supposedly post-colonial states. So my methods include ethnographic observation, various responsive and narrative interviewing techniques, and content analysis of archival and web-based documents. And my research priorities and practices are also shaped by an ongoing commitment to critical, reflexive, and decolonial philosophies. So I conceive theory and methodology as inextricably intertwined. And this methodological sensibility emerged early in my anthropological training at the University of Chicago, where I engaged with cultural theorists, social scientists, various regional specialists, and historiographers of post-colonial South Asia, including Dipesh Chakrabarti, who's quoted here regarding the indispensability but also inadequacy of European thought. So in this intellectual milieu, people generally took a very longue durée approach to conceptualizing decolonization as, of course, this mid-20th century essentially transfer of institutional and legal control over territories from European colonial powers to what historian Prasenjit Dwara terms, quote, indigenously based, formally sovereign nation states, mostly in what became independent countries on the African and Asian continents. So put simply, this global conglomeration of processes and events varied dramatically, not only in these regional contexts, but I want to emphasize it looked very different from what's been going on in settler states like Aotearoa or New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the US. I also want to emphasize that decolonization does not merely, of course, involve official handovers of power to govern, but entails a holistic process of epistemological, ontological, and pragmatic decentering and recentering, resisting and reciprocating and reframing of questions and revitalizing of knowledge forms and life ways of currently or formerly colonized peoples. So this is why I include here a quote by the renowned Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwai Smith, related specifically to decolonizing research methodologies, which I'll give you a moment to read. So in settler states, where decolonization is actively in process and essentially remains an aspiration, research is, as Tuhiwai Smith notes, a significant site of struggle, especially for people like her who do identify as indigenous. And I take this provocation seriously and approach my ongoing research with indigenous communities in a spirit of humility, collaboration, and most importantly, listening to and working with community members in ways that will hopefully actually have some benefit for or address the needs of the community, which will look very different depending on the community. So this reflects a long-standing commitment that I've had to centering the concerns and beliefs of colonized peoples, whether they identify as indigenous or not. And I do think it's also important to underscore that because colonialism, global migration, identity politics, and power struggles are imbricated in ways that mean identification with being a colonized people, this is not necessarily isomorphic, of course, with indigeneity as a legal or political category. And India is a great example of this, where actually the term indigenous is not really recognized in the constitution and usually reserved for a very small proportion of the population, less than 10%, who are more commonly termed Adivasis or scheduled tribes. So using a conception of decolonization as a culturally inflected process of mind and practice as much as political and legal devolution, I also employ a methodology that I call disjunctive comparison, or really it was coined by my colleague Sian Lazar at Cambridge, where essentially I purposely compare what in common parlance would be, apples and oranges, in order to establish a critical dialogue around specific concepts and potentially create new ones. So my comparison of distinctive forms of political organizing and claims making by police in a global South post-colony on the one hand, and a global North settler colony on the other, aims not to conflate or reduce these different cultural forms into some kind of single truth claim about what decolonization is or ought to be, nor am I trying to put forth a totalizing theory of what the police is or ought to be, or whether it ought to be a thing at all. Rather, I'm reflecting on seemingly incommensurable concepts and practices to consider how police who identify with particular colonized and marginalized communities in radically different contexts engage in principled collective action that unsettles the very foundations of the statist institutions that employ them and imbue them with the authority to intervene in other people's lives. I also consider these matters as a critical globalist, which means not only engaging the field of police studies with an eye toward demanding inclusion of various global South institutions and perspectives, but also conceiving policing itself as a global form, which crucially is not tantamount to claiming police are this kind of universal institutional actors that, to quote Walter Benjamin's critique of violence, may everywhere appear the same. Rather, I argue, quoting our handbook introduction, that we should understand policing as a recognizable family of institutions, processes, practices, and ideologies that are dispersed throughout the world in part as a result of European colonialism and imperialism, and also as part of a continuing lineage of social reproduction. I also argue that we need to reframe how we understand the central role that police play in a variety of ontological conditions and subjective experiences of security, theorized by Ian Loader and Neil Walker in their book as a global and thick public good, an indispensable constituent of any good society. There's that word again, indispensable, kind of echoing Chakrabarty's quote in the previous slide regarding European thought. Now, their analysis makes a case for conceiving the state as the anchor for the provision and meta-regulation of security in the face of the inherent pluralism that structures political communities from within and without. And I've long found this treatise on civilizing security provocative and useful to think with. I've also long been deeply troubled by what I see as its rather thin engagement with what's glossed on page 16 as the, quote, class and colonial baggage, weighing down the idea of civilization itself, which they argue in a footnote on the next page, 17, remains, this is civilization, for all of the atrocities that have been carried out in its name, a desirable and unfinished political project, end quote. I know that many of the indigenous people that I've been engaging the past couple of years would beg to differ. Indeed, many would remind us about how terms like civility, civil discourse continue to be weaponized to silence dissent as lawlessness and express these people often do so, especially in their expressions of solidarity with others, which I've been seeing personally at the University of Toronto in the encampment there, of students, which of course I know we also have a couple here, people protesting the genocide in Palestine. And just so you know, actually, it seems like things they're continuing here at my university. Actually, they just are now trying to, they've filed for an injunction to try to have the police come in, but it hasn't happened yet. And in the trespass order that they issued to the people in the encampment, there was actually a threat to any faculty, staff, and librarians that they could be disciplined even up to the point of termination if they were involved. So, as we know, I'm sure we've been watching, a lot of these things have been cleared by police, often in the name of returning to civil discourse, restoring civility. And so in light of these very, very problematic invocations of the civil, we must continue to ask, who actually decides what counts as civil dialogue or action, who even receives an invitation to dialogue, and who needs to force their way in by other means. How might uncivil activities and spaces be not only nonviolent, but potentially positively transformative? So centering these unsettling and especially timely questions and channeling the voices of perhaps unlikely police activists, I offer what I hope will be some inviting suggestions. For example, to foreground community recognition over inclusion, and pre-colonial ideas and practices of confederation over civilization, and also to integrate heretofore neglected and subordinated experiences and conceptions of what peace and security and law and order may mean in everyday practice. So what might decolonization actually look like among people who identify as police and as colonized subjects, second-class citizens, or members of any number of marginalized communities, be they indigenous, racialized, or otherwise othered, with a capital O? So I'll start with a brief summary of a case, a set of cases, really, that compelled me in this direction in the first place, namely police protests and workers' movements in India. And if any of you attended the Zoom talk I gave a few years ago here on Lawfare, some of this material may be familiar to you. So in May of 1973, there began an uprising of police constables in Uttar Pradesh, or UP, which is the most populous state in India and the one in which I've been working now for over 2 decades. And I will say this was not the first event of its kind where there was a kind of rebellion of police. There had certainly been uprisings of various sorts in other parts of what's now called India, both prior to independence in 1947 and even after in the 1950s. But at least one retired senior officer and self-styled historian did call this event in 1973 the greatest of the police agitations to hit post-colonial India. And yet it's barely mentioned in any critical historiographic scholarship, even though at the time, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi called it a national crisis. And I think that lack of mention, that silence around this event is important. So over the years, it's come to be known as the Provincial Armed Constabulary, or PAC, revolt. Although I do want to emphasize that it also involved countless constables who were part of the unarmed civil police, not just this paramilitary group, the PAC. And at approximately a dozen sites across the state where, if you can read Hindi, you can see on the tents, encampment tents, the names of the various cities where this insurgency took place. Essentially, the constables took over the armories and refused to perform duties unless and until the senior officers and civil magistrates would sit down with them and negotiate their demands for better living and working conditions. And in response, the state government not only did it eventually dismiss over 500 constables and prosecute more than 200, they also called in the National Army to come and disarm the insurgents, as they were called. So over several days, there were some violent confrontations, scores of casualties. The numbers remain in disputes. And it was an extraordinary political moment, not only because of its lethality and pitting of army soldiers against police officers, but also because it involved political activities that engendered quite strange bedfellows, with, believe it or not, university students and uniformed police officers actually marching together on college campuses, shouting slogans, like constables and students are brothers, bye bye, and long live the United Students and Police. So imagine that in many contexts. Now, I will say, this was largely a marriage of convenience because actually the police had been posted on the campuses to quell protests already ongoing by students around exam procedures and irregularities. But in any case, quite a moment. And this uprising, it also occurred in tandem with a set of unionist movements that had been building among police constables across various parts of India for years, and explicitly invoking India's history of colonial oppression and its impact on the police institutions specifically. So in 1964, some police constables in Delhi began trying to organize what they called a police karamchari sangh, or police workers union, with demands to, just the kind of common labor stuff related to wage increases and benefits. But they were also calling for an end to what they termed officer tanashahi, which means dictatorship of the senior officers, which they said derives directly from this 1861 Police Act, which remains the bedrock of police institutions in India today. So they charge the top brass with being politicized, corrupt, and generally exploiting rank and file or subordinate police by ordering them to do non-mandated work. And I'll describe it a bit more in a moment. In any case, after the Delhi constables tried and failed to register with the National Labor Commission, the parliament actually tabled legislation that became known as the 1966 Police Restriction of Rights Act, which essentially banned police from speaking out or criticizing in any way their government employer, and also from founding or joining any kind of union or political organization. And it was essentially a revision of a colonial-era statute, the 1922 Police Incitement to Disaffection Act, which is also still in effect. And actually, as recently as 2018, this Disaffection Act was invoked against two of my key interlocutors who've been leading campaigns for many years to try to found or revitalize constable unions. This is the logo of the union that was forming in 1973, the Rajya Police Karmachari Parishad. So these two constables, this was just before the pandemic, they were detained for a full year without a public hearing for violating this colonial law, and their alleged crime, among other laws, their alleged crime was using social media to organize protests by constables around a host of issues, from, again, things like working conditions, to support for colleagues who felt, they wanted to protest people who were unjustly suspended or dismissed from service. So I want to emphasize again that what these constables are protesting, what they're demanding in the way of improved living and working conditions, beyond the typical union fare, wages, benefits, promotion opportunities, and such, what's really at the center of their claims are systematic abuse, claims of systematic abuse by senior officers and other governing elites, which they attribute, again, specifically to colonial hangovers associated with what's known as the orderly system, which essentially channels unofficial, non-policing labor through official command structures. So the police, the protesting police use terms like begar, which means forced labor, or even gulam, which translates to serf or slave, to describe their being ordered to do work that goes far beyond any reasonable mandate, from domestic service like cleaning houses or taking care of children, food shopping and such. Constables are also still in many places routinely called upon to do things like yard maintenance or animal husbandry on private property, and also strenuous manual labor like open pit mining in rock quarries and construction of roads, wells, and ponds. So this is an image that one of my interlocutors gave me. It's a terrible quality, but he alleges these are police in uniform, well, partial uniform, who are actually have been ordered to work in a mine. So police activists explicitly invoke terms like manvadikar, which in Hindi translates to human rights, as principled groundings for their protests. And they usually include in the names of their organizations two other keywords, which is kalyan for welfare or well-being, and kamcharion, again, which I've said several times, which translates to workers, plural. Now, several police organizers, especially in UP, have made concerted efforts not only to form alliances with other trade unions and workers' associations. In some cases, they've even tried to establish their own political party and run for office. But not surprisingly, many organizations and voters are at best skeptical and cautious about supporting or working with police, since, after all, they're usually the ones who are coming out to repress protests rather than joining or coordinating them. And this raises a host of questions, I think, more generally related to the troubled position of police unions in the broader labor movement, especially in Global South contexts, and also the extraordinary limits that are placed on police workers' rights in relation to ideals of citizenship and the nation state as anchor for security provision. The place of police unions in the global labor movement has been controversial and indeterminate since, as just mentioned, police are usually the first to be called to break strikes, historically force people back to work, etc. And especially since the mid-20th century, I think it's fair to say that many police unions and professional associations, especially in global north regions, have emerged as conservative, often even obstructionist organizations whose primary goals are protecting colleagues, charged with misconduct, perhaps optimizing already enviable salaries and benefits, or lobbying, usually for right-wing political candidates and causes that have been detrimental to progressive movements of various stripes. That said, I do think it's important not to ignore earlier histories of police unionists who were dismissed from service following charges of Bolshevism or communism and were much more aligned with leftist social movements. I'm going to have here some old pictures of the Boston police strike, the Winnipeg strike, where many police joined in, also right here in London, just south. All happening at the same time, which, I mean, this was a particular moment, right? 1919, just, after the First World War, there was inflation and global events inspiring these things in various locations. But they're also not just a thing of the past, as I'll discuss in a moment. Police unionism, or what I've started to gloss as police worker politics, just to include things other than just formal unions, can take all kinds of unexpected forms. So turning back to the Global South and placing a critical lens on police worker politics, I believe shows how the distinctive histories of democratic transition and decolonization in these regions mean that policing and governance has evolved in ways that are substantively different from what we see here in the Global North, particularly how issues of class discrimination intersect with local cultural beliefs and political modalities. And these differences may work against assumptions that all collective action by police simply reproduces a status quo of colonial capitalism. In many contexts, police institutions, structures, and internal dynamics actually mirror and manifest broader forms of social inequality and injustice, which also troubles this assumption that I think many people hold that police activism or advocacy will always already lean to the right politically. Indeed, one of the most intriguing and instructive developments that I've been following in Brazil for the past few years is the rise of the Polícias Antifascismo, or anti-fascist police movement, which calls on the Brazilian government to demilitarize police institutions and uplift police workers from class oppression. It's very strong and active in at least a dozen or maybe now even 14 states in Brazil. And leaders have been forming alliances with a number of trade unions and other leftist groups, as well as drawing on dignitarian human rights traditions in their discourse and activities. Now, I'll just say, this is not to suggest that we should unreservedly call for support for police unions in all or even any of these places. In India, for example, where right-wing Hindutva Hindu supremacist parties have taken over governments, leading to democratic backsliding, and it looks like they're probably going to win the election that's almost over now, or coming up. I think allowing or strengthening police unions in a context like this could only consolidate the hold on power that authoritarian leaders and ideologies have, especially in the state where I work. So we do, of course, have to be very careful to, gain a nuanced understanding of, not only the political history and context of police organizing, but also, of course, the demands they're making, the kinds of networks that they're engaging, and also the state's responses, which all vary widely. So public order is still the most common reason invoked by states to restrict the rights of police to unionize or strike. And it's often framed with reference to this idea that policing is an essential service that provides public security. This is true both in the Indian case and in Brazil. And this appeal to policing as an essential service, I think it reinforces this idea that, security is a public good, even a human right. But this reveals, I think, another problematic assumption, namely, the assumption I think many of us have that police are always employed and authorized by an internationally recognized state government that embodies ideals of a sovereign nation in which the demos, the people at large, enjoy prima facie the right to self-determination and self-governance, and by association then the right to security. And such assumptions about self-governance and security are problematic, arguably unfounded, in the cases to which I will now turn, namely those of self-organized police among indigenous communities on Turtle Island. Oh, sorry. So in some of these communities, which are still calling for sovereignty and self-determination, there are police that have been actively struggling for decades to be legally and politically recognized as an essential service by the Canadian federal and provincial governments. This recognition has become one of the central demands of a group called the First Nations Chiefs of Police Association, which was established in 1993. That was their first logo there on the left, as a nonprofit organization. The FNCPA mission is to advance and sustain what they call self-administered or stand-alone Indigenous policing through partnerships that, quote, reflect the unique cultures, constitutional statuses, social circumstances, traditions, and aspiration of these Indigenous communities, and, to continue to quote, promote and contribute to holistic justice and wellness strategies. So this association formed after the establishment in 1991 of what's now known in Canada as the First Nations and Inuit Policing Program, or FNIPP. This program was supposed to reorganize and enhance support for policing in Indigenous communities and to replace over time what used to be called the Band Constable Program, which is comprised of Indigenous community members who were hired essentially as kind of auxiliary assistants to police of jurisdiction. They were not officially sworn police officers. So between the 1960s and the early 1990s, policing by, of, and for Indigenous peoples in these territories took various forms through agreements between Canadian government and elected community councils, which are established under the 1876 Indian Act in Canada. So just, yes, a word on terminology. This problematic term Indian is still used, both in popular and legal parlance, to refer to Indigenous people across Turtle Island. I only use the misnomer myself in the context of reference to colonial institutions, like, for example, the Indian residential school system, which, as you may know, an estimated 150,000 Indigenous children were forced into attending after being taken away from their families by the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or other police agents. I'll also repeatedly refer to the 1876 Indian Act, which remains in force, and very controversially so, as the primary touchstone of governance relations between the Canadian settler state and Indigenous peoples. I'll also just underline the difference between what I may refer to as Indigenous law, which is rooted in the legal orders of Indigenous communities themselves, as opposed to Aboriginal law, which consists of decisions and legislation that configure Indigenous peoples' rights and relationships with the colonial government. So since the Crown's fiduciary obligation to Aboriginal peoples is enshrined in constitutional and case law, this FNIPP program, it serves primarily as a financial cost-sharing arrangement between the Canadian federal government and provincial governments, who split 52% and 48% respectively the funding for First Nations and Inuit police services through usually short-term contract agreements that can last anywhere from 2 to 5 years. So what this means is that structurally, Indigenous policing is always already on precarious, indeed unsettled, ground. Now, unlike the earlier Band Constable program that I mentioned, police under the FNIPP are fully sworn officers with full legal powers, although these powers can be diminished or completely removed if, for example, one of these agreements between the Indigenous Community Council and the government, say, can't be negotiated right away. Indeed, some Indigenous police chiefs have shared stories of how they have had to take out private loans just to keep the lights on when negotiations didn't go well. They also say that these negotiations with the Canadian government are not done in good faith, but usually manifest just kind of a take it or leave it, here's your budget, that's it. It's not really a negotiation at all. And they're forced into accepting poor deals that keep them underfunded and unable to serve their communities well. So for these and many other reasons, the the FNIPP has come under intensive criticism, not only by Indigenous community members themselves, but even by the Auditor General of Canada, who recently issued a scathing report to Parliament. It was actually the second of its kind in a decade, for what it's worth, though, because the first one didn't really seem to have much effect. So all of this it's a key reason why the First Nations Chiefs of Police Association, the FNCPA, these leaders have been organizing to push the Canadian government to pass legislation that will officially recognize Indigenous policing as an essential service on par with other police institutions. And of course, negotiations on this legislation have stalled for years. So these police activists have started lodging complaints against the government with human rights tribunals, claiming deliberate and discriminatory under-resourcing and neglect. And this litigation often takes on a kind of class action quality led by confederated groups, for example, the Indigenous Police Chiefs of Ontario, or IPCO, which actually only formed in 2019. And just this past month, they filed a lawsuit against the province, complaining that the new Community Safety and Policing Act of Ontario, which is a huge revision of the Provincial Police Act that just came into force last month, they complain it does not make it mandatory for all police in the province of Ontario to enforce First Nations bylaws. So what this means is that while Indigenous police have to enforce the Canadian federal, the criminal code and Ontario laws, non-Indigenous police who may operate on these territories, reserved territories, or engage Indigenous people wherever, do not have to do the same for community laws. So it's reinforcing and intensifying an already very deeply unequal policing relationship. So this human rights litigation, which draws not only on Canadian law, but also international human rights law and things like UNDRIP, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, has centered, again, not only issues like wage disparities between Indigenous and, for lack of a better word, what we call mainstream police, and these disparities are stark, but also, crucially, how underfunding creates unsafe working conditions for them, the Indigenous police, and also compromises their abilities to provide security to all in their community. So turning more directly now to these communities, I would be remiss if I did not start by clarifying and emphasizing that a vast majority of Indigenous people across Turtle Island express, not surprisingly, fear, loathing, and other negative feelings toward all police, including those, even within their own community. So this is the case even if the police have been established according to community bylaws, and even if all of the police officers and staff are themselves from the community. And that's actually pretty rare. I only know of 2 communities where that can claim that. So this is largely because these Indigenous police services still derive their authority from the elected community councils. Of course, there's the history of things like the residential schools and just generally bad engagements with police. But these councils that I mentioned, they're established under the Indian Act and are thus seen by many community members as subjugated by and maintaining the settler colonial system, while dressed in the guise of self-governance or the community governing itself. So it's important to understand that many of these elected councils were actually imposed on communities when their own traditional governments were eliminated or at best pushed underground. So Indigenous police, they're considered by many to be enforcing the white man's law, and many officers concede that they are at best tolerated rather than supported by community members, and often, called traitors for being complicit in a legal architecture that still ignores or disrespects what are broadly referred to as traditional modes of governance and lifeways of the people. At the same time, many First Nations community members will also concede that they'd rather have their own self-administered police rather than, outsiders coming in and operating on their territory. And some express appreciation or at least resignation of the fact that these elected community councils, even if they are under the Indian Act, they're a vital conduit for resources in the face of a lack of political economic independence. So I think it would be overly simplistic and inaccurate to say that there's always an adversarial relationship between these elected community councils and traditional indigenous governance. And sadly, in many indigenous communities, the council is really all they have. Their traditional government's been decimated to the point where the elected council is the only functional body. In some cases, though, traditional government councils have actually managed to survive and even thrive as forces to reckon with and as viable alternatives to Euro-American legal systems. So one of the stronger traditional governance systems is that of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, still better known by its colonial name of the Iroquois Confederacy. And I have the member nations listed here in order of the original 5 from east to west, and then the bottom 4 were kind of later adopted by the Confederacy. So Haudenosaunee peoples came together under what's known as the Gayaneragoa, commonly translated as the Great Law of Peace, which aims to stop intertribal bloodshed and spread the Galileo, or what's often translated as good mind, among Confederacy members. Now, I do just want to stress that while this legal tradition is the one that I'm most familiar with, since I've been engaging mostly with Kanien'kehá:ka or Mohawk communities, I do position myself by no means as an expert in this form of law, but as a student eager to learn more as and when I'm invited by community members to continue to do so. Because I've been learning about the Gayaneragoa primarily through conversations with Indigenous police officers and other community members, and also from the writings of a prominent lawyer who resides at the Six Nations of the Grand River, named Gayanesen Paul Williams, who in his book repeats the refrain that the Haudenosaunee people are a people of law. So I can't do justice to the very complex symbologies and histories of the Gayaneragoa in the small amount of time that I have here. So I'll just highlight some key principles relevant to the analysis of decolonizing police. Because this law has held together the Haudenosaunee Confederacy for centuries, even amidst repeated attempts by colonial governments to diminish or eradicate it. And I just want to say it's embodied not only in very formalized structures of things like Confederacy Council meetings and procedures, but also in everyday practice and cyclic rituals and ceremonies at the Longhouse, which actually Haudenosaunee literally means people of the Longhouse, or people who make the Longhouse. So the constitution of the Gayaneragoa is bound up inextricably with the Turtle Island creation story, and also narratives of the founding of the Confederacy itself, how a figure known as the peacemaker brought together people who had been at war through principled encounters with individuals who again, were seen as kind of not in their right mind, either because of grief at the death of loved ones, confusion, or maybe something like mental illness. And so the peacemaker, through things like clever redirection, but also just compassionate listening and friendship, basically managed to kind of raise up or transform the thinking and action of these people toward a path of mutual aid and beneficence, support, and social responsibility. And there are many versions of this socio-legal origin story. They've been passed down through oral tradition and also the material culture of wampum belts and strings, which you can see one represented here on the lower right. So according to Williams, Confederacy governance hinges on what are known as ceremonies of condolence, wherein essentially community members show condolence or compassion when someone has passed away to their family members. And that's how then the loved ones and associates of someone who's passed away can then find the galibio, the good mind, and a new leader can be chosen. So basically the principle is that beginning with compassion for others is fundamental to the restoration of social order. And this order, it's conceived as a holistic natural order, including not just humans, but animals, plants, the elements, and that each each one has a particular set of responsibilities to others. So it's not like Jean-Jacques Rousseau's, state of nature in which human rationality comes in and brings order. It's a natural order, which everyone involved must do everything in their power to respect and protect by caring for one another. So this is the foundation of peace, Williams notes, which is never static or secure, but needs to be maintained, preserved, recovered, and spread. And he emphasizes peace is not a process, it is a process. It is not a state, which I think has a nice double entendre there. It must be continually reenacted among not just individuals or clans or communities, but also nations who recognize one another as members of a family and esteem one another's distinct gifts and potential contributions, co-creating the best world possible for the next 7 generations. And this concept of kinship of nations and governing for the next 7 generations, or essentially maintaining the world for the descendants that we will never meet, are also central to the Anishinaabe great law. And I'm even more a novice student to these traditions than I am to the Gayanergoa, who, importantly, the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe do call each other brothers. They have friendship wampums or agreements, especially this dish with one spoon covenant from, I think it's 1701. The idea being that everyone eats from the same dish and brings a spoon, not a knife. So Anishinaabe traditions are in many ways similar to those of the Haudenosaunee, and in terms of following principles for everyday life as a means to achieve for everyone a good life characterized by peace, balance, and good health. And these are related in what are known as the 7 grandfather teachings, embodied in the principles that you see listed here. And so in keeping with, again, a kind of a holistic order in which all members have something different to contribute, these principles are sometimes associated with clans or their animal members, which anthropologists have long called totems. And for just one example of how these principles may be integrated into everyday police practice, thus perhaps working to decolonize, in this context anyway, I'll relate some thoughts shared by a police officer and social worker in one Anishinaabe community that I've been working to build a relationship with. So in speaking about their police services responses to people in crisis, especially related to things like mental health and addiction, they expressed that forming strong and long-term relationships of trust and respect with community members over time was absolutely the most important part of the police's job. They further noted how vital it is that, certain kinds of historical and cultural knowledge that Indigenous police may have and use can be vital to de-escalating crises. And the officer, he said, we're like the bear or makwa in Anishinaabe, which embodies both the role of protector and also of healer. So I think you can hear how in some ways this resonates also with the Haudenosaunee ideals of compassion and the good mind. So bringing people around to a better state of mind. And this protector, healer, Indigenous police figure and its inherent tensions, I think, resonate with some debates in more mainstream police studies scholarship around how officers are routinely called upon to engage in social work or public health, broadly defined, for better or worse. I mean, of course, there's much contemporary literature on this, but I'm reminded especially of Egon Bittner's chapter in his classic Aspects of Police Work titled Florence Nightingale in Pursuit of Willie Sutton, A Theory of Police, in which he argues, Bittner, that the unique function of police the world over is to, quote, impose or coerce a provisional solution upon emergent problems without having to brook or defer to opposition of any kind. And this capacity, he continues, to intervene extends to every kind of emergency, such that police may be required to do the work of thief catchers. This is Willie Sutton himself, the infamous 1930s bank robber. thief catchers, but also nurses like Nightingale, as well as traffic control assignments, investigating heinous crimes, or even feeding ice cream to a lost child. So Bittner suggests that many police find the tension inhering in this kind of jack-of-all-trades type role perhaps too much to bear. There's a bad bear pun in there. He also notes that most police, in his experience, do shun or even disparage tasks more on the nursing side of the spectrum of their duties. And from what I've been able to gather, Indigenous police feel no differently. So I definitely don't want to give the impression that all Indigenous police somehow, conceive themselves as healers or subscribe to this ethic. There's people are variously disposed. But what many Indigenous police on Turtle Island do seem to agree on is that their day-to-day work is the very definition of community policing. Even if in practice this doesn't necessarily match up with how this catchphrase has been defined, again, in more mainstream community policing scholarship. So what community policing means to Indigenous police and, as or more importantly, to community members more broadly, also varies widely, and I would submit demands much further research. For some, like the aforementioned officers who were conceiving police like the bear, community policing seems to mean that police exist for the community and are there to serve in culturally inflected ways that mean perhaps de-escalating crises with traditional medicines like cedar, sage, or sweetgrass, or an offering of tobacco, as well as things like participating or even organizing community events like the Jauregui peacekeepers here who are doing the anti-bullying Pink Shirt Day. So there's policing for the community. There's also this idea that community policing means you actually have to be from the community that you are serving, which again, only a few, actually the Jauregui peacekeepers are one. They're one of the few that can claim every single officer and civilian staff member is from the community. Well, actually, two now are not, but they're from a sister Kanien'kehá:ka community. So, of course, there are disadvantages and advantages to being from the community. Many argue that because police, from the community may have more intimate and informed knowledge of, the historical context of certain issues demanding their attention. People say this can not only discourage police violence, but also incentivize prevention and long-term problem solving. It may even act as a kind of unofficial check and balance or oversight system in the sense that, they say that actually for them it's sometimes negative. The police officers feel like we're in a fishbowl. We're always being watched. You're going to run into that guy you arrested yesterday in the grocery store, or very often, they're called upon to arrest or deal with issues against their own family members or friends and such. Although this, in some ways, it's like any kind of small town officer, right? So I'm going to think about how much of that is being part of, an Indigenous community specifically. Other problems also can arise, of course, where maybe unofficial conflicts start to configure official business. Perhaps certain clans or community members take over the police institution, leading to charges of nepotism and such. So, there are all kinds of, you could say, both macro level and micro level problems with Indigenous policing. Most especially the issue, though, this more macro level issue where people say that there's this potential to devolve structural oppression that's been generated by the settler colonial state itself onto the communities that are most vulnerable. So this concern has been raised in a host of sectors, you could say, not just policing, but also things like child welfare, where Indigenous communities are increasingly being given jurisdiction over their own governance and social services, but then critics argue this allows the Canadian government, or whatever colonial government, to kind of wash its hands of the responsibilities still owed. Kind of Pontius Pilate politics of abandonment disguised as empowerment, right, and self-determination. So, bringing together this disjunctive comparison of collective organizing and everyday practice among police in India and on Turtle Island, I'll just summarize a few what I think are key similarities, but also fundamental differences to consider how we might think about decolonizing police institutions and police research in this era of reckoning. And in Canada, the language has recently become an era of reconciliation, which itself also a very controversial idea, specifically with regard to Indigenous peoples. So I think it's clear enough that, in both of these cases, the actors identify not only as police, but also as members of one or more marginalized communities. But more than a matter of a kind of intersectional identity politics, there are resonant expressions of experiencing social inequality and discrimination imbricated with a misrecognition, or even just outright neglect, of the necessary conditions required for police doing the work that they're supposed to do, however that may be conceived. Moreover, in both cases, police make direct appeals to human rights discourses and legal regimes. And it's not merely the rights, I hope it's clear, of the individual police officers, but the rights of police workers as a collective and of community members, of historically, again, colonized peoples. A constable in Uttar Pradesh once said to me, "The senior officers, they treat us constables the way the British did, as serfs. Are we not citizens and humans too? How can we be expected to uphold the human rights of everyone in society if we do not have those rights ourselves?" Of course, there are also significant and arguably incommensurable differences between these two cases. In India, it's the rank and file, right? The official subalterns of the police hierarchy, numbering in the tens of thousands, even just in the state of UP, in the millions across the country, who are usually the ones trying to speak out and mount challenges to the status quo. Whereas on Turtle Island, it's mostly the police chiefs and leaders who are engaging in activism. A more significant difference, though, is that while subordinate police in India tend to focus on systemic problems of exploitation by elites demanding non-mandated labor, the Indigenous police in Canada and the US don't seem much bothered with these kinds of matters. Rather than claiming exploitation, Indigenous police are advocating, or they're centering issues of exclusion and non-recognition as key determinants of their inability to provide adequate and needed services to their communities. Reflecting, again, this structural fact that the police in India are employed and authorized by an internationally recognized nation state, while Indigenous police are not. Indeed, their status, the Indigenous police, their status as police, and the statist body of law and political leadership to which they are supposed to answer remains unsettled. And their advocacy, the Indigenous police as advocates also serve to unsettle the colonial state of Canada and potentially others as well. So these social facts undergird my suggestion that we consider possibilities for not just decolonizing, but also decoupling or re-decoupling the state from our conceptions of political communities that exist in everyday social practice that may engender social transformation. The state, conceived as what my own PhD supervisor, John D. Kelly, always critically referred to as the UN world, the state need not only be, it need be not the only or even the primary anchor of security, nor of community-oriented policing and local-level peacekeeping and nation building. Now, saying this is not to rehash a lot of these decades-old debates about, the state as a social construct, or we need to bring the state back in to discussions of power relations as if it ever really left. I'm certainly not claiming that the nation state is going the way of the dodo, in the face of transnational governance, finance and technology, like the songs of the 1990s about globalization. The nation state is not going anywhere. But when it comes to policing, as denoting anything from, to return to our handbook, Ian, what we defined as the capacious notion of the general governance of people and things, or the narrowest definition or idea of detectives and uniformed personnel employed to fight crime, we need to consider how policing as social practice may operate and what it may mean in political communities that do not map neatly onto or have good relations with an extant state structure backed by its own force of law. Whether those communities, again, identify as indigenous or as some other kind of historically colonized or socially marginalized group. We must ask what is possible, not only in the way of a decolonized police, but also, or instead, what is possible in the way of security provision that is not tied to a state apparatus at all? This is at least one of the questions that I understand abolitionism to be asking. Another is the question of how we can reimagine and transform security provision for all in ways that may be nonviolent, but also still very much uncivil, in the sense of being disruptive, in the sense of pushing the boundaries of always already interpretive law, and in the sense of recognizing and calling on power holders to recognize that inequality and discrimination are themselves manifestations of structural violence. The idea of an uncivil or even illegal, but not necessarily violent politics is, of course, particularly vital in our current moment, and potentially could revitalize, I think, some of the most important lessons imparted by philosopher activists like Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., but not just them, but also, more unsung philosopher activists. One of the things that I've actually found most inspiring in the encampment at U of T is that there have actually been the entire time a circle of Anishinaabe firekeepers and elders who are actually sitting there and in solidarity with the encampment and saying, this is our land. U of T is invoking private property and such, and saying, no, actually, you've been occupying our land. We are here. You will not, if you want to move the students, you have to move us too. So I also think this idea of a nonviolent but uncivil disruptive politics, it compels us to do things like revisit the work of political theorists, post-colonial political theorists like Partha Chatterjee, who coined the term political society as a kind of uncivil counterpoint between the state and civil society, a space of institutions and activities, especially though not exclusively among the so-called lower classes, in which, he says, quote, frequent violations of laws take place in order to access government welfare and goods, end quote. And as demonstrated in the cases that I've related today, police too may engage in a variety of uncivil and potentially transformative political forms, well beyond what many assume is the raison d'etre of violence work. Police who identify or empathize with marginalized groups have a unique set of positions and perspectives that may open up some pathways, but only if they are recognized as having the potential to unlearn, to resist, and to decolonize too, and to be something other than the enemy number one of social justice, or the first line of offense against progressive social change. This is why I suggest we must better understand how, when, where, and why police may be consciously or unconsciously included in or excluded from the demos, the body politic, in a given context, as well as included in, or certainly more often excluded from, labor and other global social movements. To reframe our theories not only of police, but also of democratic governance and of decolonization as ongoing processes. This suggestion grounds a host of questions for future research. For example, what kinds of citizens are police, and how are assumptions about who and what police institutions are for configured with notions of citizenship, though I have to note here that this question would be asked very differently in many indigenous communities, where people often speak in terms not of citizenship, but community membership, or what Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson calls feeling citizenship, which is about relationships. It's not about legal status. It's about your kin, your family. Other questions that could be asked include, how might community support for and legitimation of collective organizing and transformative praxis by police, how might it vary in concert with different traditions and trajectories of democratic politics, whether they manifest in indigenous forms of confederation and holistic order, as on Turtle Island, or more individualistic classical forms of liberalism, or more socialist dignitarian rights traditions. And what might further study of myriad forms of police worker politics, my awkward term, what might they reveal or conceal about problematic Anglocentric or Eurocentric assumptions of what constitutes or detracts from democratic policing, especially, but not exclusively, in Global South regions? While I want to be clear that I acknowledge and respect the aspirations of abolitionism, I do also feel that often its outward manifestations foreclose the possibility that police, certainly not all police, but at least some of them, maybe even more than a few, may have a critical voice, may have some kind of productive, perhaps even progressive contributions, and may play a significant role in grassroots coalitional organizing towards social transformation, both through their own forms of collective organizing and perhaps more importantly, in their everyday practices through specific kinds of engagements with community members. It's easy, perhaps too easy, to paint all police with one brush and ignore the internal fractures and distinct histories of particular police institutions and their various subsets of actors. So perhaps the spirit of compassion or even confederation could be extended to police as well in certain moments and in certain contexts. I do hope that this global comparative reflection on the principled practices and expressions of at least some police may compel reconsideration of some of our deepest assumptions about these figures and the social institutions they reflect, and perhaps offer something like hope for the next 7 generations and beyond. On that note, shukriya, dhanyavad, nyawa, miigwech. That's Urdu, Hindi, Ganeagaha, and Anishinaabe Moan for thank you for listening.